Our scripture reading today comes from the Gospel of Mark, chapter 5, verses 21 to 43. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the leaders of the synagogue, named Jairus, came, and when he saw him, fell at his feet and pleaded with him repeatedly, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her so that she may be made well and live." So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed him and pressed in on him. Now there was a woman who had been suffering from a flow of blood for 12 years. She had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, and she was no better, but rather grew worse. She had heard about Jesus and came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. For she said, "If I but touch his cloak, I will be made well." Immediately her flow of blood stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Immediately aware that the power had gone forth from him, Jesus turned about in the crowd and said, "Who touched my cloak?" And his disciples said to him, "You see that the crowds are pressing in on you. How can you say, 'Who touched me?'" But Jesus looked all around to see who had done it. But the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came in fear and trembling, fell down before him, and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, some people came from the synagogue's leader's house to say, "Your daughter is dead. Why trouble the leader any further?" But overhearing what they said, Jesus said to the synagogue leader, "Do not be afraid, only believe." He allowed no one to follow him except Peter, James, and John, and the brother of James. When they came to the synagogue leader's house, he saw a commotion, people weeping and wailing loudly. When he had entered, he said to them, "Why do you make a commotion and weep? The child is not dead, but sleeping." And they laughed at him. And then he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cum," which means, "Little girl, get up." And immediately the girl stood up and began to walk about. She was 12 years old. At this, they were overcome with amazement. Jesus strictly ordered them that no one should know this and told them to give her something to eat. The term sandwich supposedly came from John Montague, otherwise known as the 4th Earl of Sandwich. According to a book of observations on English society written in the 1700s by a very curious French man, the Earl of Sandwich was a gambling addict who would play for over 24 hours at a time, not stopping to eat a full meal, but instead snacking on cold beef stuck between 2 slices of bread. Others found this dish very convenient and very en vogue, and soon everyone was eating so-called sandwiches. The legacy actually lives on, too. John Montague's great-great-great-great-great-grandson, Orlando Montague, founded a chain of sandwich restaurants called, you guessed it, Earl of Sandwich. And you can visit one locally in downtown LA or in LAX the next time you go to the airport, or downtown Disney in Anaheim. Now, I would never want to tarnish the Earl's legacy, but the gospel writer Mark was creating sandwiches about 1,500 years earlier, except Mark was making his sandwiches with stories. Mark begins a story and then places another story in the middle and then finishes the first story. At first glance, it might seem like just disorganized storytelling, but scholars have decided that Mark is actually trying to reveal a deeper truth to both stories with this sandwich technique. And the key is often found in that middle story, or the peanut butter of your sandwich. Now, this literary device is used 9 different times in the Gospel of Mark. Although if you comb through very carefully, I think you'll also find what I call mini sandwiches, where Mark places really important details that are seemingly out of place in the middle of a story, and it sort of reveals something deeper. It drives home his point. Now, because Mark's sandwiches sounds very tasty, but it's not very Lenten, we've decided to give this sermon series a more seasonally appropriate and contemporary name for surprises that are found in different forms of media. These are known as Easter eggs. So today, if you watch a movie, or you listen to songs, or you watch music videos, or you play video games, you'll often find these Easter eggs are meant to reveal hidden messages within this media. Sometimes it refers to another piece of media, something iconic. Sometimes it's an inside joke for those who are really devoted to this franchise, but it's for anyone who is worth paying close attention. And so we begin our sermon series, Mark's Easter Eggs, Stories Within Stories, with a look at one of his most famous sandwiches, the healing and resurrection of Jairus' daughter as the beginning and the end, and the healing of the hemorrhaging woman in the middle. Now, the thing you need to know about Jairus for this story to make sense is that he did not like Jesus, and he didn't like what Jesus was doing, performing miracles and teaching about God and attracting all of these followers. Jairus was the local leader of a synagogue in Galilee, and just a few chapters earlier, we read that Jesus is really starting to annoy all of the local religious leaders in Galilee. He's letting his disciples harvest and eat grain on the Sabbath, and he heals a man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. And those are the stories when Jesus says things like, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath." And which is lawful on the Sabbath, to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? And the religious leaders just scowl at Jesus because he's breaking their rules and he's crossing their ritual boundaries and he's claiming to be the Son of God while he does all of this. In fact, at the point in the gospel where Jairus comes to Jesus, those religious leaders are already plotting Jesus' death. So it's a big deal that the leader of the local synagogue comes to Jesus and falls at his feet in the middle of a huge crowd and begs him to heal his daughter. And when Jesus agrees, they begin walking across the town to Jairus' house. And you know all of the other religious leaders are watching this spectacle and cursing Jairus under their breaths for publicly admitting that Jesus is worth following. He's publicly switching teams here. And as for Jairus, well, he can kiss any dreams of rising to religious power in his most interesting circles goodbye, because he is sacrificing his friendships and his professional clout and his reputation, all for the sake of healing his daughter. But what a small price to pay if your child is gravely ill. And so they make their way to his home, and you can imagine that Jairus is overwhelmed with emotion. He's feeling the gratitude of restored hope that his daughter might survive after all, the anxiety of, are they going to be too late, the fear of Jesus actually not being able to heal her after all this. And so as the crowd is pushing and swelling and pulsing their way across town to see this prophet perform his next miracle, a woman reaches out and touches his cloak. And Jesus comes to a complete stop. And he looks at his disciples and he said, "Who touched me?" And his disciples think he's joking. "Who touched you? Jesus, all of Galilee is trying to get their hands on you right now. What do you mean, who touched you? Let's go to Jairus' house. If you can heal his daughter, it would be a great political move for our camp. Perhaps the Pharisees would change their minds about us, and I don't know, maybe we'd all get invited to Jerusalem for like a big thank you banquet or something. Jesus, let's go. Come on, Jesus, let's go." But Jesus will not take another step until he figures out who has touched him. He looks around the crowd. He scans all of the faces. He sees faces of excitement, faces of nerves, faces of confusion. He looks at the dumbfounded disciples and all the skeptical looky-loos on the fringe. He looks at all the children who have no idea what's going on but are being dragged along by their parents. Jesus looks, and he looks, and he looks, and he looks. And you can practically hear Jairus' heart pounding. "My daughter is dying. Jesus, what are you doing? Why do you care if someone touched you? Let's go, let's go." Finally, a woman steps forward. Mark says she does so with fear and trembling, and she confesses that it was she who touched his cloak. And Jesus calls her daughter and says, "Your faith has made you well. Now, Mark says Jesus is still talking to this woman when people from Jairus' house come and tell him the bad news. Your daughter has died. Let's not bother Jesus anymore. And you can only imagine how that feels to Jairus. If only Jesus had hurried, maybe they would have made it in time. Why did he stop for this other woman? What about my daughter? What about my daughter? What about my daughter? She could have been healed. But Jesus looks at Jairus and he says, do not be afraid. Only believe. And they go on to the house, they go inside, and Jesus announces the girl isn't dead, she's just sleeping. And then he takes her by the hand and tells her to get up and walk, and she does. And everyone is amazed. So what is Mark trying to tell us about these two women? Why does he sandwich the bleeding woman in the middle of this story about Jairus' daughter? Well, the first thing we need to ask is why it was such a big deal that the bleeding woman touched Jesus' cloak, and why she had to admit it to him with fear and trembling. She was scared. She didn't want to come forward and admit that she had touched him. And the reason is that in Leviticus 15:25-30, it states, when a woman has a discharge of blood for many days at a time other than her monthly period, or has a discharge that continues beyond her period, she will be unclean as long as she has the discharge, just as in the days of her period. Any bed she lies on while the discharge continues will be unclean, as in her bed is during her monthly period. Anything she sits on will be unclean, as during her period. Anyone who touches them will be unclean. They must wash their clothes and bathe with water. They will be unclean until that evening. When she is cleansed from her discharge, she must count off 7 days, and then she will be able to go and be ceremonial clean. On the 8th day, she must take 2 doves or 2 young pigeons and bring them to the priest at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And then the priest is to sacrifice one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. In this way, he will make atonement for her before the Lord for the uncleanness of her discharge. Well, she didn't do any of that. So this woman has been bleeding for 12 years, meaning she was ritually unclean for 12 years. She was unable to participate in the life of her community for 12 years. Anyone who touched her would be ritually unclean themselves for the rest of their day. So we can assume that when the text says she had endured much under many physicians and had spent all that she had, this woman was always the doctor's last appointment of the day because they knew they were going to be ritually unclean until that night. It's very possible that she had even gone to see Jairus himself at the synagogue and begged for his help in this matter, and perhaps he too had been unable to help her. Jesus is her last hope, and she reaches out and she grasps for one more chance to heal. It was reasonable for her to be afraid then when Jesus stops in his tracks and demands to know who touched him. She knows she's done something transgressive here. She has broken through a ritual barrier. It is possible that she has made this famous man very angry. But gosh, she's feeling better. She stopped bleeding after 12 years, so worth it. Now, I'm guessing that she figures if Jesus knows who touched him in the middle of a huge, noisy crowd, he can probably figure out that it was her. So she takes a deep breath, and she decides to just come forward and confess. And imagine her relief when Jesus calls her daughter and tells her that her faith has made her well. And then Jesus goes on and raises Jairus' daughter. Notably, she's 12 years old. The woman has been bleeding for 12 years, and he raises her from the dead. And this is also significant because Mark explicitly tells us that Jesus touched her. He takes her by the hand, Mark says. And lo and behold, if we look back in Numbers 19, it states, whoever touches the dead body of anyone will be unclean for 7 days. He must purify himself with water on the 3rd day and on the 7th day. Then he will be clean. But if he does not purify himself on the 3rd and 7th days, he will not be clean. Whoever touches the dead body of anyone and fails to purify himself defiles the Lord's tabernacle. That person must be cut off from Israel because the water of cleansing has not been sprinkled on him. He is unclean. His uncleanness remains on him. Now, The laws in the book of Numbers and Leviticus are part of what's called the Holiness Code, and these were laws that were given to Moses by God as the Israelites were forming into a new people group under their covenant with God. This comes after they were freed from slavery in Egypt, and many of the laws are like Community Health 101. It's an ancient civilization trying to parse out how to handle things like blood and other bodily fluids, and how to handle corpses and food, and how to handle wild animals, and how to till the land, and it's that kind of law. But they're framed with the language of holiness and delivered specifically to the leaders and the priests of the community as a way to separate things that are clean from things that are considered unclean. And it's an attempt to create order in their new Israelite society, but it's interwoven with this idea of how to be holy. So you can see how muddy the waters become when cleanliness and health get mixed up with labeling people clean and unclean, which is what is being described in both of these stories in the Markan sandwich. So to recap, in both stories, Jesus heals a female, one older and one younger, who are in physical states that would define them as ritually unclean in the Israelite community. And Jesus is touched by one and chooses to touch the other, thereby making himself also ritually unclean. But in doing so, Jesus is repeating the message that he told the Pharisees about eating and healing on the Sabbath. These laws were made to help you as a community, to connect you as a community to one another and to God. They were not intended to disconnect you from one another or from God. And so if that is what they are doing, these laws are no longer relevant. Do you see now why Jesus was destined to be killed? He was flipping the script that the Israelite community had learned to live and die by. He was taking power away from the religious leaders who had used these holiness codes and ritual laws to maintain their power and separate people from one another into categories. So in the Gospel of Mark, when Jesus keeps telling everyone, be quiet, don't tell anyone about this healing or this miracle, and don't be afraid, it's because he's trying to buy himself a little more time. He knows that as word spreads about what he's doing, his life will be on the line. And he knows that everyone is afraid of what he's doing because he's shocking the system. He's actually tearing down the system and rebuilding it in his image. Jesus is transgressing the very carefully constructed ritual barriers of his own community and claiming that he's doing it as God's will. So the Easter egg message Mark is revealing here is this: do not be afraid when Jesus breaks down a barrier. It's what he came to do, and each time he breaks another one, he opens up more space for God to move. That's a word for you today as well. Do not be afraid when Jesus breaks down a barrier in your life. He's making more space for God to be there and to move. When Jairus' daughter is raised from the dead, she walks around. And I love that because it's almost like she's proving to her parents that she is alive and well. And as they stare in astonishment, Jesus tells them to give her something to eat. It's perhaps a detail to reinforce that she is okay, that she is once again their living, breathing, healthy, eating little girl. Little girls who are growing need to eat. And if it were up to Mark, I bet he would suggest that they give her a sandwich. Welcome to Lent, friends. Amen.